The desolate village of Elden Hollow. The village of Elden Hollow lay nestled in the shadow of the Blackreach Mountains, a place where the sky was perpetually grey and the wind howled like a wounded beast. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and burning tallow, a constant reminder of the village's meagre resources. Craggy stone buildings, their once proud facades now weathered and cracked, stood in a haphazard arrangement as though abandoned by fate itself. The streets were narrow and uneven, littered with refuse and the remnants of failed harvests. Here, life was a constant battle against the elements, and the people of Elden Hollow had long since learned to endure, not to hope. Among them was Kaelen, a boy of 10 summers, with eyes that held the weight of a life already burdened by hardship. He had been born to a family of blacksmiths, though their forge had long since fallen into disrepair, its once glowing embers now nothing more than a faint ember in a forgotten corner. His father, a man whose back was bent with years of toil, had died in the cold of a particularly harsh winter, leaving Kaelen and his mother to scrape by on the meagre wages of the village's few remaining laborers. The boy had grown up in the shadow of his father's forge, watching the sparks dance in the air as his mother labored over the remnants of their trade, hammering out crude tools for the village's farmers and hunters. Each day was a struggle. The village had no surplus, no coin to spare, and the few traders who passed through were quick to take advantage of the desperate. Kaelen had learned early that survival was not about dreams, but about work, back-breaking labor that left him with aching limbs and a mind that longed for something more. He had heard stories of distant lands, of cities where gold was as common as dirt, and where the sky was not forever shrouded in gloom. But such tales were the province of children, and Kaelen had no illusions. He was a boy of the village, bound by the weight of his circumstances, with no hope beyond the narrow path of survival. Yet even in the depths of despair, there was a flicker of something else, something unspoken, buried deep within the boy's heart. A longing that no amount of hardship could extinguish, though it remained a distant dream, like the sun behind the mountains, never to be reached. A glimmer of possibility. The day the stranger arrived, the wind had stilled, as though the village itself held its breath in anticipation. Kaelen had been sweeping the cobbled streets, his small hands raw from the rough stone, when he first noticed the man standing at the edge of the village square. He was unlike any traveler Kaelen had ever seen, tall and lean, draped in a cloak of deep indigo that seemed to shimmer in the dim light, as though woven from the very fabric of twilight. His face was obscured by the hood of his cloak, but the way he stood, poised and unmoving, gave Kaelen the strange feeling that the man was not merely a traveler, but something more. The villagers, too, had gathered, their murmurs of curiosity and suspicion rising in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Some whispered of omens, of prophecies spoken of in the old tales, while others simply watched, wary of what this stranger might bring. Kaelen's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing with questions. Who was this man? What did he want? And why had he come to Elden Hollow, a place where even the most desperate had long since given up on hope? The stranger finally spoke, his voice low and measured, carrying the weight of something ancient. "I seek a boy of Elden Hollow, one who has not yet surrendered to the weight of his fate." A hush fell over the gathered crowd. Kaelen felt the words settle in his chest like a stone, his breath catching in his throat. The stranger's gaze, though hidden beneath the hood, seemed to pierce through him, as though he could see the boy's unspoken dreams and the longings that had been buried deep within his soul. Kaelen's mother stepped forward, her face lined with years of toil and sorrow. "What is it you seek, traveler?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The stranger tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. "A boy who has the strength to rise beyond the chains of his birth, who has not yet lost the fire that burns in his heart." Kaelen's breath hitched. The words struck him like a hammer against an anvil, a sharp, searing pain that made his knees weaken. He had never considered himself anything more than a boy of the village, a child of hardship with no future beyond the life he had been born into. Yet in that moment, the idea of rising beyond his fate, of becoming something more than the sum of his struggles, seemed to flicker in the back of his mind like a spark in the dark. The stranger turned to Kaelen, his voice softer now, almost like a whisper. "If you wish to be more than you are, if you are willing to take the path that others fear to walk, then I have a task for you, a journey that will change the course of your life." Kaelen's heart pounded in his chest, his mind a whirlwind of fear and possibility. He looked at the stranger, then at his mother, then back at the man who had come to Elden Hollow. He had spent his life believing that he was bound to this place, that his future was already written in the soot-stained walls of the village. But now, standing before this enigmatic traveler, he felt something stir within him, something he had not felt in years, a spark of hope, fragile but real, and for the first time in his life Kaelen found himself wondering if there was more to him than the boy of Elden Hollow. The trials of the road. Kaelen's journey began with the weight of uncertainty pressing upon his shoulders. The stranger had offered him a task, a chance to step beyond the boundaries of Elden Hollow and into a world he had only ever heard of in whispered tales. But the path ahead was not one of easy triumph. It was a road fraught with hardship, where every step tested the limits of his endurance and will. His first challenge came. Not long after he left the village, when the road became a narrow trail winding through the Blackreach Mountains. The air was thin, the cold biting at his skin, and the wind howled through the craggy peaks like a vengeful spirit. Kaelen's boots, worn and patched, slipped on the uneven stones, and his muscles ached from the climb. He had never walked such a path before, had never known the weight of a pack on his back or the gnawing hunger that came with the absence of food. The boy who had once swept the streets of Elden Hollow now found himself trudging through the wilderness, his body and spirit pushed to the brink. The first night was the hardest. The stars above were unfamiliar, their light dimmed by the towering peaks that loomed around him. Kaelen huddled beneath, a tattered cloak, his breath coming in shallow gasps as the cold seeped into his bones. He had no fire, no food, and no knowledge of the land beyond the village. The thought of turning back, of returning to the only life he had ever known, was a temptation that gnawed at his mind. But something within him refused to yield. He had taken the first step, and now he could not turn back. As the days passed, the trials only grew more severe. He encountered a band of wandering mercenaries who sought to rob him, their blades flashing in the dim light of the forest. Kaelen, though frightened, found himself standing his ground, his heart pounding as he faced them with a resolve he had never known he possessed. Though he was no warrior, he did not run. He fought with all the strength he could muster, his hands raw from the clash of steel, his body battered from the struggle. In the end, he escaped, but not without scars, both on his skin and in his soul. Yet, for all the hardships, there were moments of triumph that flickered like firelight in the darkness. One such moment came when he stumbled upon a hidden spring deep within the mountains, its waters clear and cool. He had been on the verge of collapse, his strength nearly spent, when the sight of the spring reignited a spark of determination within him. He drank deeply, the water restoring his strength, and for the first time in days he felt a flicker of hope. As he continued his journey, Kaelen began to understand that the path ahead was not merely of the world Kaelen had known, but of something greater, something hidden beyond the reach of ordinary men. Elric led Kaelen through the dense forest, where the trees grew so thick that the sky above was little more than a distant memory. The boy followed in silence, his thoughts a storm of confusion and fear. He had no idea why Elric had chosen him, nor what purpose he served, but something in the older man's gaze told him that this was no mere coincidence. He was being guided, shaped, tested. The first lesson came with the dawn. Elric stood before Kaelen, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. "You are strong," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But strength alone will not carry you through the trials ahead. You must learn to see beyond the limits of your own understanding." Kaelen frowned, his mind still reeling from the previous night's encounter. "What do you mean?" he asked. Elric turned to face him, his eyes gleaming with an intensity that made Kaelen feel as though he were being weighed, measured, and found wanting. "You have been given a path, but you must walk it with purpose. You must learn to listen, not just to the world around you, but to the wisdom that lies within your own soul." Kaelen did not understand, but he listened. That day, and the days that followed, Elric taught him things that no one in Elden Hollow had ever known. He spoke of the old ways, of the magic that had once flourished in the world before it was buried beneath the weight of time. He showed Kaelen how to read the stars, how to listen to the wind, how to see the world, not as a place of hardship, but as a living thing, filled with secrets waiting to be uncovered. At first, Kaelen struggled. His mind was filled with the teachings of the village, with the belief that the world was a place of struggle and survival, where only the strong endured. But under Elric's guidance, he began to see the world differently. He learned that knowledge was power, that understanding was the key to overcoming the obstacles that lay ahead. One of the most difficult lessons came when Elric placed a small, unmarked stone in Kaelen's hand. "This is a stone from the forgotten path," he said. "It is said that those who walk this path must carry it, and only those who truly understand its purpose may find their way forward." Kaelen stared at the stone, puzzled. "What does it mean?" Elric's gaze was unreadable. "It means that you must find your own path, not the one others have chosen for you. You must learn to trust not only in your own strength, but in the wisdom that lies within you." Kaelen clenched his fists, his heart pounding with the weight of the words. He had spent his life believing that he was bound to the life of Elden Hollow, that his future was already written in the soot-stained walls of the village. But now, standing before Elric, he felt something shift within him. He was no longer just a boy of the village. He was something more. The lessons continued, each one more difficult than the last. Elric taught him to harness the power of the wind, to feel the pulse of the earth beneath his feet. He showed him how to wield a blade, not with brute strength, but with precision and purpose. He taught him that true strength was not in the body, but in the mind, in the will to endure, to rise, to fight. And as the days passed, Kaelen began to change. The boy who had once been afraid of the unknown now faced it with determination. The boy who had once believed his fate was already written now saw the possibility of something greater. Elric watched him with quiet satisfaction. "You are beginning to understand," he said one evening as they sat beneath the stars. "But the path ahead is still long, and the trials you must face are only beginning." Kaelen looked up at him, his heart full of both fear and hope. He had come a long way from the boy of Elden Hollow, and though the road ahead was uncertain, he now knew that he was no longer walking it alone. The trial of the shattered crown. The journey to the heart of the Blackreach Mountains had tested Kaelen in ways he had never imagined, but nothing had prepared him for the final trial that lay ahead. Elric had led him through the winding paths of the mountains, deeper than any traveler had dared to go, until they reached the ruins of an ancient kingdom buried beneath the snow and stone. Here, in the forgotten halls of the lost kingdom of Byleth, the final test awaited. The air was thick with the weight of history, the silence broken only by the distant howl of the wind. The ruins, once grand and mighty, now stood as a monument to the past, their towering spires broken, their once glorious halls now overgrown with ivy and time. At the center of the ruins, a great stone dais rose from the earth, its surface etched with runes that pulsed with a faint, otherworldly light. And upon it, resting atop a pedestal of blackened marble, lay the shattered crown, a relic of immense power said to be the key to unlocking the ancient magic of Byleth. Elric turned to Kaelen, his gaze steady. "This is the final trial," he said. "The shattered crown can only be claimed by one who is worthy. You must prove that you are not merely a boy of Elden Hollow, but a man who has walked the path of the forgotten and emerged stronger." Kaelen's heart pounded in his chest. He had come so far, endured so much, and now the final test lay before him. He stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists, his breath shallow. He had no idea what he would face, but he knew one thing. He would not turn back. As he approached the dais, the air around him grew heavy, as though the very world was holding its breath. The runes on the stone pulsed brighter, and from the shadows a figure emerged. It was a warrior clad in armor of darkened steel, his face obscured by a mask of shattered glass. His presence was overwhelming, his aura radiating power and fury. "You are not worthy," the warrior said, his voice like the grinding of stone. "The shattered crown does not belong to you." Kaelen's breath caught in his throat. He had expected a trial, but not one that would force him to face an opponent of such strength. He had no sword, no shield, only the knowledge he had gained from Elric and the strength he had found within himself. The warrior lunged, his blade flashing like lightning. Kaelen barely managed to dodge, the edge of the sword grazing his shoulder. He staggered, pain lancing through him, but he did not fall. He had come too far to be defeated now. Drawing on the lessons Elric had taught him, Kaelen moved with precision, his body no longer driven by instinct alone, but by understanding. He felt the weight of the world around him, the pulse of the earth beneath his feet, the rhythm of the wind in his hair. He was no longer just a boy of Elden Hollow. He was a man, forged by the trials of the road. The warrior struck again, but this time Kaelen was ready. He twisted his body, his movements fluid and deliberate, and with a swift motion he struck the warrior's blade with his own, the force of the impact sending a shock through his arms. The warrior faltered just for a moment, and in that instant Kaelen saw his opening. He lunged forward, his hand closing around the shattered crown. A surge of energy coursed through him, a power unlike anything he had ever felt. The runes on the stone flared with light, and the air around him vibrated with the force of ancient magic. The warrior roared in fury, his blade flashing toward Kaelen once more. But this time Kaelen did not retreat. He raised the shattered crown, and with a single, decisive motion he channeled the power within it. A wave of energy erupted from the relic, striking the warrior with the force of a storm. The figure was thrown back, his form dissolving into the shadows, his voice fading into the wind. Kaelen stood at the center of the dais, the shattered crown in his hands, his body trembling with exhaustion. He had done it. He had faced the final trial and emerged victorious. Elric stepped forward, his eyes filled with something Kaelen had never seen before. Pride. "You have proven yourself," he said. "You are no longer the boy of Elden Hollow. You are something greater." Kaelen looked down at the shattered crown, his heart pounding with the weight of what he had accomplished. He had come so far from the boy who had once swept the streets of his village, who had believed his fate was already written. Now he stood at the threshold of a new beginning, the power of the shattered crown in his hands, and the knowledge that he was no longer bound by the chains of his past. He had risen beyond the limits of his birth, and in doing so he had become something more than he had ever imagined. The return to Elden Hollow. Kaelen's return to Elden Hollow was not marked by the grandeur of a hero's triumph, but by the quiet, undeniable weight of change. The village, unchanged in its haphazard arrangement of stone and timber, still bore the marks of hardship, but now, in the eyes of its people, there was something different, a flicker of something that had not been there before. The boy who had once swept the streets of Elden Hollow had returned, not as a boy, but as a man, his journey etched into the lines of his face and the fire in his eyes. The first to see him was his mother, standing at the edge of the village square, her hands wrapped tightly around the worn fabric of her cloak. She had not aged, but something in her posture had changed, as though the weight of her son's absence had been lifted from her shoulders. When she saw him, her breath caught, and for a moment she could not speak. Then, with a trembling hand, she reached out, her fingers brushing against the fabric of his tattered cloak. "You've come back," she whispered. Kaelen nodded, his voice steady despite the emotions that threatened to spill over. "I have." The villagers gathered, their murmurs of curiosity and awe rising like the wind through the narrow streets. Some had heard the tales of the boy who had left Elden Hollow, of the stranger who had taken him on a path unknown, of the trials he had faced, and the power he had claimed. Now they saw him standing before them, the weight of his journey written in every step he took. But it was not only the villagers who had changed. Kaelen had changed as well. The boy who had once believed his fate was already written in the soot-stained walls of the village was no longer the same. He had walked the path of the forgotten, had faced the trials of the mountains, had stood before the shattered crown and claimed its power. He had become something greater, not through wealth or titles, but through the strength of his will and the fire that had never been extinguished within him. Yet, as he looked upon the village, he felt the weight of his return. He had left Elden Hollow with the hope of something more, of a life beyond the hardship that had defined him. Now, standing before the people who had once called him their own, he realized that the journey had not only changed him, it had changed them as well. The blacksmith's forge, long abandoned, now stood with a renewed purpose. The villagers, who had once lived in the shadow of their own struggles, now looked upon Kaelen with something new in their eyes, not just admiration, but the possibility of something greater. He had returned not as a boy of Elden Hollow, but as a man who had walked the path of the forgotten and emerged stronger. And in that moment Kaelen knew that his journey was far from over. He had risen beyond the limits of his birth, had claimed the power of the shattered crown, and had returned to Elden Hollow with the knowledge that he was no longer bound by the chains of his past. He was no longer bound by the chains of his past. He was no longer just a boy of the village. He was something more. The legacy of the shattered crown. Kaelen did not return to Elden Hollow as a man of wealth or power, but as a man who had walked the path of the forgotten and emerged stronger. The shattered crown, the relic of ancient magic, had not been a prize to be claimed for glory, but a burden that had shaped him, tested him, and ultimately transformed him. He had not sought power for its own sake, but had accepted it as a responsibility, a duty that came with the strength he had found within himself. In the days that followed his return, Kaelen did not immediately seek to change the village. He did not demand recognition, nor did he seek to rule over the people who had once called him their own. Instead, he listened. He walked the streets of Elden Hollow once more, not as a boy who had been born into hardship, but as a man who had faced the trials of the world and had come back with the knowledge of what was possible. He saw the village not as a place of endless struggle, but as a place of potential, a place where the fire that had burned within him could be kindled in others. He began by teaching. At first it was only small things, how to read the stars, how to listen to the wind, how to see the world not as a place of hardship, but as a living thing filled with secrets waiting to be uncovered. He spoke of the lessons Elric had taught him, of the strength that came not from wealth or titles, but from the will to endure, to rise, to fight. And slowly the people of Elden Hollow began to listen. The blacksmith's forge, long abandoned, was not rebuilt in a single day. It was not a matter of coin or trade, but of purpose. Kaelen worked alongside the villagers, not as their master, but as their equal. He showed them how to shape metal, not just for survival, but for artistry, for strength, for the future. He taught them that the path of the forgotten was not one of despair, but of transformation. And as the forge burned once more, as the first sparks of steel and fire danced in the air, Kaelen knew that he had not only changed himself, he had changed Elden Hollow. The boy who had once believed his fate was already written was no longer bound by the chains of his past. He had risen beyond the limits of his birth, not through wealth or power, but through the strength of his will and the fire that had never been extinguished within him. The shattered crown had been his greatest trial, but it had also been his greatest gift. It had not given him riches, nor had it granted him titles or recognition. Instead, it had given him purpose. It had given him the knowledge that he was not just a boy of Elden Hollow, but a man who had walked the path of the forgotten and had emerged stronger. And so, the legend of Kaelen, the boy who had risen from the ashes of hardship to claim the power of the shattered crown, would be told for generations to come. Not as a tale of wealth or conquest, but as a story of transformation, of a man who had walked the path of the forgotten and had found his place in the world not through power, but through purpose. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories. Hit the notification bell to be notified of new stories when they become available. Feel free to leave a comment and tell me if you enjoyed the story and want to hear more like it.